Stand clear of the closing doors, please.
Welcome aboard, everyone, to another episode of Democracy Exchange with The Depot, the one-stop station where we engage in conversations to foster understanding.
We're your hosts, Connor Hand
and Anna McRay.
And we have a very special guest with us today on the podcast, Mr. George Beebe. He is a Grand Strategy Director for the Quincy Institute, a trans-partisan action tank working across partisan divides to achieve peace through diplomacy.
Mr. Beebe has also spent more than 2 decades in government as an analyst, diplomat, and policy advisor, including as CIA Russian Desk Director. Mr. Beebe, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
To start the episode off, we're going to briefly discuss the background of the conflict for our viewers who are unaware. After 8 years of isolated conflict between the Ukrainian military and pro-Russian separatists in Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk provinces, the Russian government under President Vladimir Putin ordered a so-called special military operation on Ukraine in February 2022. After the initial Russian invasion and a few subsequent Ukrainian counterattacks, both militaries have been fighting in a mostly static front line. Nations like the United States, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom have expressed various levels of support, from passing economic sanctions against Russia to shipping military equipment directly to Ukraine. Recently, President Donald Trump has expressed a desire to end the conflict and has personally met with Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. For our first question, we'd like to know your pathway to where you are now at the Quincy Institute. Why have you made Russia, and by extension, U.S. relations with Russia, a highlight of your career?
Well, it's funny. It happened sort of accidentally. So I grew up in New England. My dad was an engineer. He took a job in Massachusetts at one of the federally funded research and development organizations called MIT Lincoln Laboratory. And when I was in high school, he came home from work one day and said, "Guess what? We are moving to the Marshall Islands." I was a junior in high school at the time, and I immediately thought, this is about the worst thing that I could possibly imagine. I'm going to move my senior year to a part of the world I'd never heard of and live on a small island. And, I thought this was terrible. And immediately said, I don't want to go. And I quickly learned that I really didn't have a veto over this. So we moved to the island of Kwajalein, which is the biggest island on Kwajalein Atoll, which is the largest atoll in the world. The lagoon is 765 square miles for the trivia buffs out there in the audience. And one of the noteworthy things that happens there is that the U.S. military tests intercontinental ballistic missiles that get fired from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, and they land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in this lagoon. And people that develop radar, which my father was involved in, test and refine the capabilities of the radar, and the missile guys test and refine the capabilities of the missiles. And this was going on during the Cold War, and the Soviet Union had an intelligence collection ship that would patrol the waters outside the lagoon, and they would track the U.S. missiles that were coming in. All of this was done under the provisions of arms control treaties that the United States and Soviet Union had, and we each monitored the other side's missile launches. And so I got interested in all of this. Who are these guys that are out there sailing around in this boat? What is the Cold War all about? What is the Soviet Union all about? And I ended up studying this in school, in college, just out of curiosity, not thinking that I would make any kind of career out of it. But wound up taking a class in graduate school that was taught by somebody that used to work at the CIA. And after class one day, he said, "Hey, have you ever thought about working at CIA?" And I said, "No." And why are you talking to me? But he said, "No, what CIA analysts do is not all that dissimilar from the kinds of things that we're looking at in this class, and I think you'd be interested, and it's a good place to work, and look into it. So I did. I applied, and they made me an offer. It was the only offer I received, so kind of easy to say yes. And not really knowing what I was getting into, but I found that I enjoyed this work a lot. I liked the people that I was working with, and the subject was, I thought, quite compelling, and ended up making a career out of it.
That's amazing. For viewers who are unfamiliar with this conflict that's going on in today's world, or may hold some common misconceptions, what information do you believe is crucial that they know?
Well, I think when you think about the conflict in Ukraine, what's most important is understanding what kind of problem are we facing. And I think there is a large body of people that think what we're facing in Ukraine is what I would call a World War II problem, where they think of Russia a lot like Nazi Germany, an autocratic, aggressive state bent on acquiring more territory, expanding its empire, dominating Europe. And the only way that you deal with a problem like that is through deterrence. It's through military force. It's by showing that bully state that it can't succeed in its ambitions, that the costs of aggression are more than outweighed, or the benefits of aggression are more than outweighed by the costs. And you bring about deterrence. You prevent that state from realizing its ambitions. But one of the things that people, I think, don't consider is that we may be, in fact, facing what I would call a World War I problem. World War I didn't start because an aggressive bully state said, hey, I want that territory on the other side of my border, and I want to go get it and conquer it. It wasn't a war of ambition. World War I resulted from what international relations theorists call a security dilemma, a situation where a state or group of states form alliances and build up military capabilities that they think will enhance their own security. But those steps actually are perceived as threatening by neighboring states or neighboring groups of states. And you end up in a spiral of escalation, a cycle of action and reaction that results in a conflict that both sides think they're taking defensive steps. And you wind up in a war that nobody actually wants. And what I would say about the war in Ukraine is how you diagnose this problem matters a lot to your success in prescribing a solution. If you've got a World War II kind of problem, a deterrence problem, the way you settle that, the way you deal with that is through deterrence, is through military force. It is through building up military capabilities, showing a willingness to fight. But if you've got a World War I kind of problem, an escalatory spiral problem, more military force actually makes the problem worse. It intensifies the cycle of escalation. The way you solve a World War I style problem is through diplomacy. And what I think has happened in Ukraine is we've been in an escalatory spiral for many, many years that has intensified over time and eventually brought the United States and its allies into a collision course with Russia that will only intensify unless we approach this through diplomatic means, unless we seek a compromise in which each side's core interests, their vital security concerns, are addressed. But you compromise on things where you can afford to compromise. I think that's the pathway out of this. And the Biden administration for many years approached this like we had a World War II problem. I think the bulk of Washington, the bulk of Europe, and the bulk of Ukrainians regard it as such. But in fact, we're dealing with a World War I kind of problem. And so diplomacy is going to be essential to finding a solution here.
The United States has been known to change its position on supporting Ukraine. What are some of the key changes between the start of the war, when Obama was in office, and now under the Trump administration?
Well, I think the key change here is a desire for a diplomatic resolution of this conflict. I think the Biden administration, in the months leading up to the Russian invasion and the period immediately following it, believed that this war was an elective for Russia. That Russia had ambitions, and that the way you would prevent the Russians from either invading or the way you would compel them to end the conflict is by showing the Russians that the costs of this invasion outweigh the benefits. And so what we did was say, we're going to ratchet up these costs. We're going to impose onerous economic sanctions on Russia. You recall President Biden saying we're going to turn the ruble into rubble. We imposed extremely stringent economic sanctions on Russia to show Putin and the Russian government and the Russian people that they were going to come under extreme economic hardship as a result of their actions. Plus, we imposed real costs on the battlefield. We used our intelligence capabilities to provide the Ukrainians with advance warning of where the Russians were likely to attack. We helped them defend themselves to know where the attacks were coming from, know what to target to blunt the success of Russia's invasion. And we provided them with the weapons systems that could be effective in imposing high battlefield casualties on the Russians. And we were hoping that those things would have a very strong deterrent effect on Russia and convince Putin that this just wasn't worth it. And then there was a political dimension to this, too. We tried to isolate Russia in world politics, turn Putin and Russia into a pariah on the world stage, make him persona non grata. And the hope was that Putin would look at all this and say, this just wasn't worth it. The benefits of what we're getting in this invasion are more than outweighed by all these drawbacks. Now, the problem with that was, A, it didn't work. But B, I think it was a misconception of what was driving Russian behavior. And this is something that I think most Americans don't understand. The Russians didn't see this invasion as an elective, as something that was nice to do, something that could bring benefits. They saw it as a must-do, something where Russia's existence was at stake, which I think most Americans think of as very difficult to understand or grasp. Why would the invasion of another country be critical to Russia's own existence? That doesn't make sense, I think, to most people. But to understand this, I think you have to realize that Russia has a different approach to its security and a different feeling about what's essential to Russia's own existence than, for example, the United States does. We're a country that is geographically blessed in a lot of ways. We have two large oceans that protect us. We have neighbors to the north and south that don't pose military threats to the United States. We are, by historical standards, very, very secure, in part because of our geography. Russia, on the other hand, exists on a flat, open plain without natural geographic barriers to invasion. And so the Russians, through hard experience, have come to believe that their security depends on putting geographic distance between their heartland and potential invaders. And Ukraine, of course, has played a central role in that over the centuries. The Russians have been invaded many times, both from east and west, but those Western invasions have tended to go right through Ukraine. So when the Russians look at Ukraine and think that Ukraine might be allied to the world's most formidable military alliance, NATO, and that NATO in turn, even if Ukraine doesn't become a formal member of the alliance, might put military infrastructure and weaponry on Ukrainian territory. That poses, I think, from the Russian point of view, a real threat. And the notion that NATO or the United States, from that point in Ukraine, might put pressure on Russia internally is one that the Russians were not willing to live with. To them, that posed an existential threat. Not all that dissimilar to the way the United States regarded Cuba back in the Cold War during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The notion that the Soviet Union could put offensive weaponry on Cuban territory was one that the Kennedy administration regarded as an existential threat to the United States, something that deterrence alone was insufficient to protect us against. And they demanded that Cuba not ally itself militarily to the Soviet Union, and that the Soviet Union remove that missile force from Cuban territory. And this became a crisis point. And the Russians, to some degree, regard the prospect of Ukraine's military alliance with the United States or its hosting of NATO military forces as a similar kind of security threat. So that's something I think most Americans don't understand, but I think it's essential to finding a way out of the situation that we're in right now.
So knowing this, what potential changes do you expect to arise upcoming, especially concerning Russia?
Well, I think the Trump administration believes that a diplomatic solution to this conflict is essential, that the Ukrainians aren't going to win this war on the battlefield. They're not going to drive Russia off Ukrainian territory that Russian forces now occupy. So given that we can't force Russian capitulation, what we need to do is compromise. And that compromise can't capitulate to Russian demands. There are certain things that we are not going to accept from Russia, certain things that are non-negotiable on our part. But there are things where we can reach reasonable compromises that ensure that America's vital interests are protected, that Ukraine's vital interests are protected, and Europe's interests that are crucial to European security are addressed too. Now, the Russians believe that there are certain things that they absolutely essentially have to have in any kind of a settlement. I think the two most important ones for Russia are to make sure that Ukraine does not become a part of NATO and that Ukraine does not host NATO member state combat forces on its territory. But beyond that, I think there are a lot of things that are potentially negotiable, areas where we could compromise. And you're starting to see progress toward that compromise over time. I think it's clear that the United States has been signaling that we are willing to prevent Ukraine from becoming a part of the NATO alliance. I think that's it's been clear both under Obama and President Biden that we were not going to go to war with Russia to defend Ukraine with American troops. And if that's the case, then it really doesn't make any sense to undertake a treaty obligation to do so by bringing Ukraine into the alliance. But I think we're also willing to be flexible on the question of putting American or NATO member combat forces on Ukrainian territory. I think we're signaling that's an area where we might be able to find a compromise of some kind. And I think the Russians are also signaling that they're willing to compromise on something that I regard as very important to Ukraine and its future, and that is the prospect of Ukraine's membership in the European Union. Back in 2014, when the Maidan Revolution erupted, that was a central issue for Ukraine. A lot of Ukrainians wanted the possibility of becoming a member of the European Union, anchoring Ukraine politically and economically inside the West, and looking forward to a period of freedom and economic prosperity that would flow from that membership. And the Russians in 2014 said no. We regard that as something that's unacceptable from Russia's point of view. Well, I think the Russians have now budged on this. And President Putin just this past week made a public statement saying that Russia would not stand in the way of Ukraine's accession to the European Union. And to me, that is, in fact, a central issue on which a compromise could be possible. We agree with Russia that we're not going to make Ukraine a military ally of the West, that it will be militarily neutral, not a member of any alliance, East or West. And Russia, in turn, says we're willing to live with Ukraine's political and economic anchoring in the West. This is very similar to what happened with Finland and Austria, both of which were militarily neutral during the Cold War, not a member of NATO, not a member of the Warsaw Pact, but they became members of the European Union. And that worked out very well for Austria and Finland. I think it helped usher in a period of great prosperity there. And I think that's the kind of compromise that could leave Ukraine with a hopeful future, with the possibility of freedom and prosperity, even if they're not a member of the NATO alliance. And I think that's the kind of compromise that we're moving toward.
On August 15th, President Trump met with President Putin in Alaska. Trump brought with him a slew of economic advisors and reportedly considered joint ventures in the natural gas and oil industries. This hints at an economic deal between the two nations. What potential changes might we see with this at the negotiating table?
Well, I think the prospect of greater U.S.-Russian economic cooperation is one of those carrots that helps to incentivize the Russians to compromise in Ukraine and end this war in some sort of mutually acceptable way. I think it also is an indication that the Trump administration is thinking well beyond simply a settlement in Ukraine. I think they are looking for broader U.S.-Russian détente, an improved relationship with Russia. And I think the reason why they are hoping for this has a lot to do with changes in the broader global order. So 25 years ago, at the start of the new millennium, we were in a unipolar world, one in which the United States no longer had a peer competitor. The Soviet Union had dissolved. We didn't have a bipolar world, a competition between the Western and Soviet blocs. The United States was really unchallenged in its military, economic, and political influence in the world. And now we're in a situation where the United States has a peer competitor in China, a country that is certainly an economic peer. By some measures of GDP, the Chinese economy is larger than that of the United States. A country that is a technological competitor in many areas, and a country that is deeply integrated into the world economy, and as well as deeply integrated into the American economy in ways that the Soviet Union never was. The Soviet Union was a military superpower, but economically weak and not integrated in the world economy. So how do we deal with this Chinese challenge? How do we contend with this competition in ways that don't lead to direct warfare between the United States and China, which would likely go very poorly for everybody involved? Well, I think what the Trump administration is thinking is we need to establish a balance within a world that is becoming multipolar, where you've got rising regional powers, India. You've got a former superpower, Russia, which has regained its footing in a lot of ways and has a good deal of influence within its geographic region, even though it's not a peer of the United States. And then you've got other contenders that have more and more options in this multipolar world. And we saw that this week at the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in China. Now, in the prelude to that meeting, the United States had imposed sanctions, tariffs on India, an additional 25% tariff in a bid to disincentivize Indian purchases of Russian oil. And the Indian reaction to this was not just to say no to the United States, but the Indian Prime Minister Modi went to China, participated in this meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and showed the United States India has options, that we can't simply coerce them into doing what we want. The world has changed, and that period of time when the United States had such power that we could simply force other countries to bend to our will is over. Now, given all of that, given that we have this new multipolar order that's emerging, the Trump administration looks at Russia and says, okay, we actually have an interest in a better relationship with Russia. We have an interest not in incentivizing Russian cooperation with China in security matters against the United States, right? You don't want to unite your adversaries. You want to the degree that you can, divide them because your geopolitical challenges are that much more manageable. And we need Europe to step up in this new multipolar order so that it becomes a pole and can help to counterbalance Russia. Russia can in turn help to counterbalance China. And you have stability and order that flows from a balance of power in this multipolar world that is emerging. So I think those considerations really lie at the heart of what the Trump administration is trying to do in its relationship with Russia and in trying to end the war in Ukraine. Now, can we pull this off? That's another question. It's not an easy thing to do. We don't have a lot of experience diplomatically maneuvering in a multipolar order, certainly not during the nuclear era. And it's a complex act. There are a lot of moving parts that you have to consider. So this is a formidable challenge of statecraft. But I think the Trump administration has the right idea in how we should try to manage the situation.
You have been in the role of advising leaders, such as former Vice President Dick Cheney, in your intelligence and foreign affairs regarding Russia for nearly 20 years. With your expertise, what advice would you give our leaders as they enter what are hopefully the final stages of negotiation?
Well, I think in any kind of negotiation, it really comes down to leverage. What kinds of carrots do you have, incentives that can encourage your negotiating partners to agree on things you want them to agree to? What kind of sticks do you have? What kind of coercive leverage do you have that can work with the carrots and bring people to the point that you want them to come to? Usually military force is a necessary part of this, not so much in using it, but having it out there in the background as a not-so-subtle incentive to settle things at the negotiating table rather than let things come to the brink of direct military confrontation. So that's part of it. Part of this is you have to know what your own interests are. What things are absolutely essential to the security and prosperity and well-being of the United States? What things can you not compromise on? What things are nice to have, things that if you can accomplish them, great, but they're not essentials, they're not red lines. If you have a clear understanding of what you absolutely have to get out of a negotiation, things that you cannot compromise on, and a clear understanding of where you have some flexibility, and then understand where are the overlaps with the other side. Where are things where you think they have some flexibility? Where are things that you think they have none? Where are their red lines? Those are essential preconditions for success in a negotiation. Then you have to have negotiators that can take all this into account and actually turn this into a settlement, a compromise that all of the players recognize meets their essential objectives, and that the areas where they've compromised are things that they can afford to compromise on. And then finally, there's the element of trust. That's an intangible in all of this. And a lot of people approach this situation with Russia and say, well, you can't trust them. They won't adhere to any kind of agreement. They will simply lie. They will agree to things on paper that in practice they won't live up to. The interesting thing about this situation is the Russians feel almost exactly the same way about us. You can't trust the United States. They say one thing and do another thing. They promised us back during the Cold War that if we agreed to the reunification of East and West Germany, that they would not move NATO eastward. Well, what did they do? Now NATO's at the very doorstep of Russia. They've withdrawn from arms control agreements that we both agreed to and were foundational elements in the stability of the U.S.-Russian relationship. The only language that the United States understands is force. So it's fascinating to look at this and see the parallelism between perceptions of Russia in the United States and the West on the one hand, and perceptions of the United States and the West in Russia on the other hand. So there has to be a trust-building element of all of this. And that takes time. It takes a lot of contact. It takes a lot of patience. It takes some exercises in building trust by agreeing to some small things that you follow through on and show the other side you're serious about reaching a compromise. It takes a while. You don't do this in 1 or 2 meetings or 1 or 2 weeks or 1 or 2 months. But the combination of all of these things over time, I think, can lead to some agreements that can put Ukraine on a path toward peace, can help stabilize Europe, mend this bleeding wound that's in the center of the European region, and also stabilize the broader relationship between Russia and the United States, who, we shouldn't forget, together hold over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. So this is not a relationship that we should be complacent about by any means. There's a lot at stake in this.
You recently co-wrote an article about how loose security guarantees can reverse recent progress in peace talks. Could you please elaborate on that for our viewers and add on other aspects that might hinder the peace talks?
Well, yeah, this question of security guarantees is a big one. And I think a lot of people in Europe, in Ukraine, in the United States that believe we've got a World War II problem here, a deterrence problem, believe that the war in Ukraine can't end unless there is some substantial combat force stationed in Ukraine that can defend Ukraine against a future invasion. And the problem with that, of course, is that the Russians regard that prospect as an existential threat to Russia. This is what international relations theorists call a security dilemma. Efforts that the Ukrainians want to undertake to enhance their own security are perceived by the Russians as a threat to Russian security, and vice versa. So we need to be careful in not offering medicine to solve this illness that makes the patient worse, that makes the situation worse. And if we put together a security package for Ukraine that actually incentivizes the Russians to accelerate their military operations, to prevent the emergence of a combat force in Ukraine that we would regard as defensive, we will actually undermine the prospects for a settlement. So what I think we need to be aiming for here is a way of ensuring Ukrainian security that doesn't, in fact, provoke the Russians. Now, that's not an easy thing to pull off, but I do think there is a ground for compromise there. Now, what would that compromise look like? It might involve the creation of a European combat force that could be deployed on short notice to deal with future contingencies, but is based in Europe itself, not on Ukrainian territory. I think that's something the Russians could probably live with and wouldn't be anywhere near as provocative as putting NATO member state forces on Ukrainian territory. I think we could negotiate some arms control limits on what kinds of weapons the Ukrainians hold that the Russians would regard as offensive and threatening. Long-range strike missiles, for example, is an area where we could probably compromise and the Russians could probably compromise. And what the Russians would concede in return for that kind of limitation would be that principle that Ukraine can get defensive military support from the West. Weapons, training, maintenance of systems that are essentially designed to defend against Russian attacks. I think those are the areas that we're going to have to zero in on that enable Ukraine to have a robust self-defense capability, enable Ukraine to count on future support from the West in the event of an invasion, but also recognize Russia's own security sensitivities here. And that's kind of a happy medium that in principle I think is possible. It will be a hard negotiation. It will take some time to find out where that balance point is.
Thank you. For our final question, we'd like to turn the attention back to you. For our listeners who might be interested in one day serving in the roles and fields you've been a part of, can you tell us about some of your takeaways from your professional careers and maybe give some advice for how aspiring listeners can one day end up in your shoes?
I would certainly encourage people that are interested in this field to get involved. It's been a career that I found very rewarding. I've worked on things that I find personally interesting, and I'd like to think that I had at least some small impact on some of these issues over the years. If this is something that people do find interesting and want to get involved in, I think the starting point is education. It's building expertise in this area. Part of that is in the classroom, but I think an even bigger part is outside the classroom in what you're reading. What kind of information are you consuming? What kind of books are you reading? Are you following these issues through the thousands of different information sources that are out there? The more you read about what's being written on these issues, the more you're able to understand the different schools of thought, the different points of view. What are the pivot points in these debates? Why do reasonable people come to different conclusions about all of this? That will prepare you, I think, to be more effective in starting a career in this area. And then I would encourage language study. If you're going to get involved in international affairs, it very much helps if you master foreign languages, if you immerse yourself in the culture of the countries that you want to build expertise in. That in turn facilitates travel. It facilitates discussion with people that you might not otherwise really be able to exchange views on. It deepens your understanding of these issues. And that's the kind of preparation that in turn various organizations involved in this field will look at it and say, yeah, those are the kind of people we want working for us. They can bring something to what we're trying to do.
Well, that's all we have for today. We'd like to thank Mr. Beebe for joining us and for his insight. Thank you so much. We'd also like to thank our social media and podcast team, Bryn Drabeck, Julia Amlin, and Thomas Williamson.
And a special thanks to Falcon Radio and our founder, Dr. Robert Alexander. And we've been your hosts and researchers, Connor Hand
and Anna McRay. Make sure to join us next time at the Democracy Exchange. Bye for now. To find the video version of this podcast, you can find us on our YouTube page at BGSU Depot. If you'd like to keep up with what we're doing, make sure to follow our Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at BGSU_Depot. Thank you to all of our listeners, and make sure to watch our YouTube and subscribe to our page. Follow us for more content.